So with any luck I'll get this finished today, because I'm rapidly running out of time. But it's the day after Halloween, so judgment is somewhat impaired. But let's see what we can do. So you can see where we're up to. We have our frame to go over the top of the pond. We have our frame to hold the frame over the pond, and then we have the pond itself. And at this stage we're going to put the butyl rubber around the edge. The design process went something along the lines of find our wire grate. That determines our maximum size of the pond. Then build a frame from the materials available. So I had 1.8 metre fence posts and a 2.3 metre as well. So that was at my maximum size. And then I flipped the frame over so the wire was down, and then I constructed this holding frame on top of it. So they should be the same size, just to make sure. It's always worth paralleling it to make sure that it'll fit, because once this is going to be constructed, then we're just going to set the frame on top, and if it doesn't fit, then that'll be a nightmare. This is back to my preliminary design stages. It's the first time I've brought together the wire and the posts and so on, and I'm just testing the strength. So I anticipated that it'd be strong enough to bear my weight, and as you can see it is. Once the frame is nailed together and the wire is nailed to the frame, it gets much stronger, because then the wire is really under tension whenever it's supporting your weight and not just under pressure. So at this stage I'm taking great care to make sure that the measurements are correct. You don't want to make mistakes at this point, because then you'll have to undo the mistakes, which takes twice as much time. So this was a lucky happenstance. Just happened to be that the two cuts that came with the post that were slanted fitted together perfectly and provide the right angle. So at this point I'm making sure I'm putting the shorter of the two cuts, the two lengths of timber, to the outside. This means that it'll have a better profile overall. So in theory the two posts were cut to the same length, but in practice there'll always be a small differential. So once again I'm going back to the wire frame and measuring twice the length of it, and then measuring the frame and making sure that the two will line up. I don't really have enough materials to make mistakes at this point, nor do I have enough time. So cutting through these fence posts with a handsaw is can be seen to be a bit silly, but it's only a matter of patience. Make sure you keep the cut as straight as you possibly can, and keep your eye on the saw blade, and as far as possible try not to cut any parts of your own body. Funny enough, this is the most brutal cut I had to do. It's a very slowly tapering cut to allow these two pieces of timber to meet up at a very tight angle. As with many of these cuts, the trick is to just take it slowly and keep your eye on the blade, and then make sure you stick to your line and think about what you're doing. I do make a mistake whenever I'm fixing this piece of timber to the frame, whereby I nail the tapered edge before I nail the not tapering edge, which means, well, you'll see. So fixing this frame together was an absolute nightmare. I started off working with screws. Unfortunately, the cordless screwdriver I was using was lacking in torque and then battery power. Also, I didn't have any bits with me in order to drill pilot holes, which were utterly necessary under the circumstances. So if you're doing this, make sure you get a good drill bit and drill and pilot hole everything. When deciding where to put in the screws as well, always think about avoiding knots, because if you run into a knot and you're screwing into something this size, then it's just going to be a nightmare. You're not going to win. I also bought some strapping to put onto the joints. I also bought some stainless steel nails or screws to go with it, but these were worse than useless. They're up there with a chocolate fire guard. I purchased the stainless steel screws because metal in water can add extra iron and can cause slight problems for the pond itself. I'm just trying to take little precautions. It's not a big deal, but if I could avoid using normal iron and steel, I would, but the stainless steel screws were not strong enough. So at this point I was fixing the tapered edge of the piece of timber. The problem is that if that piece of timber moves back and forward a centimetre, you will not notice it on the tapered edge. But on the near side, a centimetre here or there makes a big difference, makes about 10 centimetres worth of difference. So you'll see that was my one problem. So as they say, only Allah is perfect. I called it an intentional mistake. So at that point I popped into town and I got myself some 6-inch nails, which I'm now hammering in. You can see I'm using a technique called side stitching as well. This is much easier because when you're initially entering the timber, you're going with the grain rather than against it. So my strategy was just put in lots of nails. Each one of those joints probably has about 6 fixings in there, nails or screws, going at different angles. So if they try to pull out, then they're always going to be pulling against each other. So I constructed the frame in 2 parts. I constructed the near side and then the far side, and then I was just joining them together. Unfortunately, my battery ran out, so you don't get to see me fixing on the wire onto the top of the frame. But I simply placed it in position and went around using large staple nails to nail the wire down to the frame. So as you can see, I'm starting to construct the holding frame. Eventually I will get clever and flip the actual cover over and use it as a proper template to build on, just to make sure they're the right size. So I'm just cutting the outer edge, and then I'm using the same angle on the other side. So that means they only have to cut once, and it also very much reduces the waste. So when I'm constructing this frame, I'm making it about 1 inch bigger than the actual wire frame on top. This allows a little bit of wiggle room. To be honest, once it's in position, it looks really snug and tight. It is an amateur thing to do to cut something too tight. Unfortunately, once again, my battery runs out, so you don't get to see the final construction of the supporting frame, but I'm sure you'll be able to work out what to do. The retaining frame will actually be most vulnerable to rot because it's sitting in an environment which will become wet and become dry. The idea of having the frame submerged should actually protect the timber, because timber rots whenever it gets wet and then dries out. As the timber swells and contracts, that's the thing that does the most damage. So this is the frame in situ. The decking timbers are 6 inches wide, and I've actually put it so that the side sits on top of the base plate. This should submerge the timber frame. So I'm just going to flip over the frame for the finishing touches. As you can see, I've still got quite a bit of excess wire. So I'm just going around with a pair of bolt cutters, which will cut the wire frame. Doing this with a hacksaw would be a nightmare. Doing it with an angle grinder would be fine, and using an angle grinder would also help you finish off the edges possibly slightly better. But to be honest, I quite like working with a bolt cutter. Because the fencing panel was quite dinged up, I have to do a bit of extra work around that side just to sort of clean it up. So what I'm doing here is I'm actually hammering down any bits of wire which are sticking up. So you don't want anything that can snag. I like to be a bit particular with this. Also, I'm hammering off any potentially loose wires, so just any loose ends, I'm just hammering them down. Also being very careful that there's no sharp edges around the sides of the frame that might catch and rip the butyl rubber. So if you're hammering something and it's bouncing, then the nail won't go in, so try and make sure you're hammering into a solid surface. So as you can see, the wire frame has become very strong at this point. So just finishing touch, go around painting the various surfaces. This will do no harm. So as I mentioned, the metal rusting in water isn't necessarily that great for the pond life. So any little bits of metal, then also galvanized staple nails, just go around and touch them over. Basically it means that the paint will have to wear off before the galvanized surface starts to become corroded. Also just painting any cut ends on the fencing panel. The fencing panel is just iron or steel, which has been plastic coated. So any cracks in the plastic or any cut ends should be covered. I'm also going over and covering any of the nail heads and screw heads. That also protects them. And to be honest, if you wanted to paint over the end grain of the timber, that would also very much protect the timber. So this is where I'm finishing for today. I've got the frame built. In theory, this just needs to be dropped into place, and that will take 2 people. I want to put some handles on this to make it easier to carry. So I simply make the handles out of some nylon rope, a couple of knots in the end, and then just steeple nailed into position. This is to discourage people by lifting up on the wire, because that could have a tendency to pop the little welds and break the wire. So carrying the frame is obviously a 2-person job, ideally a 4-person job. So we just pop it into position. As you can see, you just need a little bit of encouragement. So I take great satisfaction in walking over the top, and this will provide an excellent viewing platform for the life in the pond.